Now, I hope you remember that this morning I was trying, in the brief space of 50 minutes, to give you a basic introduction to Mahayana Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism that is found in China and Japan, and the kind of Buddhism of which Zen Buddhism in particular is a subsect. And we are rather particularly concerned with Zen, since it has had such a fundamental influence in the shaping of Japanese culture and the arts of Japan, and since we are in the course of this informal tour going to be visiting a good deal of Zen monasteries and seeing a great deal of Zen formed works of art, architecture, and so on. So I want to lead now tonight from Buddhism in general, or Mahayana Buddhism in general, to Zen in particular. Now, Zen plays a little game with you. Whenever anybody like myself or Dr. Suzuki talks about Zen, all the other people say, because they talk about it, they don't understand it. Those, in the words of Lao Tzu, who know do not say. Those who say do not know. And yet he said that. He wrote a book of several 80 chapters or so to explain the Tao and the De, its power, and nobody can help themselves. They've got to talk. Human beings are a bunch of chatterboxes. And when we've got something in our minds that we want to talk about, we talk. Now, poetry, though, is the great language, because poetry is the art of saying what can't be said. Every poet knows this. You're trying to describe the indescribable, and every poet also knows that nothing is describable. Whether you take some sort of ineffable mystical experience at one extreme, or whether you take an ordinary rusty nail at the other, nothing is really describable. In the words of the famous Count Korzybski, whatever you say something is, it isn't. We used to have a professor at Northwestern who would produce a match booklet in front of his class and would say to them, "What is it?" And they would say, "Match booklet." And he'd say, No, match booklet is a noise. Is this a noise? What is it? And so to answer this, he'd throw it at them. That's what it is. So in this way, you see, nothing can really be described. And yet, on the other hand, we all know perfectly well what we mean when we talk. If you shared an experience with somebody else, then of course you can talk about it. We can all talk about fire and air and water and wood because we know what it is. And there's no mystery. So in the same way, when it comes to discussing something so esoteric as Zen, it can be discussed. Only Zen people play games with each other. They play little tricks. They test each other out by saying to somebody, I remember when I met Paul Reps for the first time, who wrote that lovely book, Zen Flesh and Zen Bones. And he said to me, "Well," he said, "you've written quite a number of books by now. You must think you're pretty fancy." I said, "I haven't said a word." This is simply a Zen game. And people sort of feel each other out. There's a poem which says, "When two Zen masters meet each other on the road, they need no introduction. Thieves recognize one another instantaneously." So now, having got that off my chest, it's to say then, if I were to give you a really proper and really and truly educative talk about Zen, I would gather you round here and sit here in silence for 5 minutes and leave. And in a way, this would be a much more direct exposition of it than what I'm going to do instead, which is talk about it. Only I have a feeling that you would feel that you were disappointed and somewhat cheated by this kind of behavior if I just left in 5 minutes silence. So then, this word Zen is Japanese way of pronouncing the Chinese word Chan, which in turn is the Chinese way of pronouncing the Sanskrit word jhana. And jhana is a very difficult word to translate into English, if not impossible. It's been called meditation. Meditation in English generally means sitting quietly and thinking about something. And that's not what Zen is. Contemplation might come a little nearer if you use the word in a very technical sense, the sense that it was used, or still is used, among Catholic mystics. Perhaps that's something a bit like Zen. But again, contemplation, as we normally use the word, has a sense of inactivity, a sense of not doing anything, of being completely still and passive, whereas Zen is something highly active. So we really don't have an English word for jhana, Chan, Zen. But I would say that we do know what it is because we do all sorts of things every day of our lives in the spirit. When, for example, you drive a car, most Americans, at any rate, drive cars since they were teenagers and are very expert drivers. And when they drive a car, they don't think about it. They're one with the car. Or when a rider of a horse is one being with the horse, when you watch a good cowboy or a cavalry rider, he's glued to the horse. He's like a centaur almost. As the horse moves, he moves. Which is in control? Is the horse riding the man or the man riding the horse? You practically don't know. Same way when you have an excellent dancing partner. Who leads? Who follows? It seems as if you are one body and you move together. That is Zen, that is jhana. And so in a wider sense, when a person doesn't react to life, on the one hand, or try to dominate it on the other, but when the internal world of one's own organism and the external world of other people and other things move together as if they were and indeed are one and the same motion, that is Zen. So you could say in a very, very simple way that the real concern of Zen is to realize, not merely to think, but to know in your bones that the inside world inside your skin and the outside world outside your skin, going out as far as anything can go into galaxies beyond galaxies, is all one world and all one being, one self, and you're it. And once you know that, then you have completely abolished all the problems that arise as a result of feeling that you are a stranger in the world, that you are set down in the middle of a hostile and alien domain of nature or people who are not you. This whole sense of estrangement, foreignness to the world is overcome in Zen. Now, let me illustrate this a little before we go into Zen in any kind of technical way by a few rather superficial but nevertheless significant facts out of Japanese culture and the place of Zen in Japanese culture. Japanese culture is, as you may have noticed, or was, as you may have noticed, extraordinarily ritualistic. There is a right way of doing everything, a good form, a proper style. And nowhere is this more apparent than in such practices as the tea ceremony, or arranging flowers, or knowing how to dress, or knowing how to organize a formal dinner. The punctiliousness, the skill of these people in doing these things is quite remarkable. But in the same measure as they are very skillful at doing these things, they're very worried about it. The whole question, for example, of bringing presents to somebody else. Have they given us more than we've given them? Did we remember this occasion? Did we remember that occasion? These weigh very heavily on the Japanese soul. The debt which you owe to your parents, the debt which you owe to your country and to your emperor, immeasurable, infinite debt, never can be paid. All these weigh very heavily. And therefore, in Japan, until the sort of breakaway of modern youth with its westernized ideals, this is a very nervous culture, concerned about whether one is playing the ritual correctly. A culture like that needs an outlet, needs a safety valve, needs a way out of this thing. And Zen provides just that. And so, by contrast, when you meet a Japanese who is thoroughly trained in Zen, he is a different kind of personality altogether from ordinary Japanese. He is, in manners, not studiedly courteous, nor is he brusque, but he's simply at ease. He gives you his whole attention, so long as you give him your whole attention. If you start wandering and frittering, he's got work to do and he promptly leaves. But so long as you are wanting to talk to him, he is there for you and for nobody else. And he sits down, and he really sits. You know, he doesn't worry about whether he ought to be somewhere else. And so unable to sit with complete serenity in one place. You know, if you have half an idea that you ought to be worrying about something out in the garden, or that you ought to be cooking dinner, or that you ought to be down in your office or something, you can't sit where you are. You're not really there. You're a kind of gas balloon that keeps wanting to wander off. But these people, when you see, as you meet people connected with Zen, even sometimes the most neophyte, novice of a priest, has this atmosphere of knowing how to live in the present and not to be fidgety and giggly and worrying about whether he's done the right thing. So that's very much Zen style. Even though at the same time the Zen people do have a very exacting and demanding discipline. The function of this discipline is rather curious. It's to enable you to be comfortable. It's to enable you, for example, to sleep on a concrete sidewalk on a cold, wet night and enjoy it. To relax completely under any situation of hardship. You see, ordinarily when you sit you're out in the cold, you start shivering. Why? Because you're resisting the cold. You're tightening your muscles against the cold, and you get the staggers. But you were taught, if you learn Zen discipline, not to do that. Take it easy. Go with the cold. Relax. And all those monks in those monasteries here, they're as cold as hell in winter. And they simply sit there most of the time, and we would be frozen to death and miserable and have influenza and the great Siberian itch. but they simply relax and learn how to take the cold. So there's nothing about Zen discipline which is masochistic. It isn't to beat your body because your body's bad and there's a creation of the devil or something. It has nothing to do with that. It is how to be comfortable under all circumstances. But that again is something rather incidental to the main question of Zen. As I said, the Zen people, as you meet them and as you get to know their style of personality, are at ease in a culture that is not at ease. In a culture that is chronically concerned with protocol. And is it just right? That is indeed a terribly self-conscious culture, where everybody is always watching themselves and having therefore second thoughts about everything. And so the discipline of Zen is to enable you to act without watching yourself. We would say unself-conscious. But Japanese are as terrified of this as we are. They think, and we think. If I don't watch myself, I'll make a mistake. If I don't hold a club over myself, I'll cease to be civilized and become a barbarian. If I don't discipline myself with all sorts of down on those passions of yours, you will become like the monk of Siberia who burst from his cell and devoured the Father Superior. So this basic mistrust and so on in one's own spontaneity makes us wonder that if the Zen people are really spontaneous and they don't plan and premeditate and hold clubs over themselves, won't they become very, very dangerous people socially? Won't they go out and rape their mothers and daughters and murder their grandmothers to inherit their fortunes and so on and so forth? And Zen people just don't do that. And yet they are perfectly spontaneous. So then, let me try then and indicate how this discipline called Zen actually works. This will involve a little bit of letting the cat out of the bag, but can be helped. Let's go back to what I told you was fundamental to Buddhism. Buddhism is unlike other religions in that it does not tell you anything. It doesn't require you to believe in anything. Buddhism is a dialogue. And what are called the teachings of Buddhism are nothing more than the opening phrases or opening exchanges in the dialogue. Buddhism is a dialogue between a Buddha and an ordinary man, or rather someone who insists on defining himself as an ordinary man, and thereby creates a problem. I quoted you this morning our saying that anybody who goes to a psychiatrist ought to have his head examined. And in exactly the same way, in this culture, anybody who goes to a guru, a spiritual teacher, or a Zen master, or whatever, ought to have his head examined. Or as the old Chinese master Tokuzan put it, if you ask any question, you get 30 blows with my stick. If you don't ask any question, you get 30 blows just the same. In other words, what the hell are you doing around here? Defining yourself as a student and defining me as a teacher. In other words, you have raised a problem. And in the way of training of Zen, this is very clearly emphasized. If you go to a Zen teacher and you approach him in the traditional way, the first thing he will do is to say, I haven't anything to teach. Go away. Well, you say, what are these people doing around here? Aren't they your students? You say, well, they're working with me, but unfortunately, we are very poor these days. We don't have enough rice really to go around and make ends meet. And we can't take on anybody else in this community. So you have to insist to be taken in. Every postulant for Zen training assumes immediately that the teacher has given him the brush off in order to test his sincerity. In other words, if you really want this thing, you've got to work for it. That isn't the real point. The point is that you've got to make such a fuss to get in that you cannot withdraw gracefully after having made such a fuss to get in. Because you put yourself on the spot and you define yourself as somebody needing help or as somebody with a problem who needs a master in order to be helped out of the problem. So then when you've done this, in the old days, of course, and it's still the formal rule among the Zen monasteries here, that when you're a postulant and you want to come in, you have to sit outside at the gate for a week or maybe only 5 days in a position of supplication with your head on bowed down on the steps. And they let you in at night because they must give hospitality to any wandering monk, but you're expected not to go to sleep any of those 5 nights, but to sit there in meditation. And they give you food. But you sit and you sit and you sit there and you make a damn fool of yourself, saying, I insist on getting into this thing. I insist on learning. I want to know what the secret of this master here is. And he's told you from the start that he doesn't have a secret and that he doesn't teach anything. But you insist that he does. See, that is the situation of everybody who feels that life is a problem to be solved. Whether you want psychoanalysis, whether you want integration, whether you want salvation, whether you want Buddhahood, whatever it is you define yourself as wanting, you created the problem. What is the real problem that everybody brings to these teachers? What is it all about? It's basically this, isn't it? Teacher, I want to get one up on the universe. I feel a stranger in this world. I feel that it's a problem in that having a body means that I am subject to disease and change and death. Having emotions and passions means that I am tormented by feelings which I can't help having, and yet it's not reasonable to act on those feelings without creating trouble. I feel trapped by this world, and so I want to get the better of it. And is there some wise man around who is a master of life and who can teach me to cope with all this? So that's what everybody's looking for in a teacher, the man who is the savior and who can show you how to cope with it. And the Zen teacher says, I don't have any answer. Nobody believes that because he seems to be so confident when you look at it. You can't believe that he has no answers. And yet that's the consistent teaching of Zen, that it has nothing to say and nothing to teach. The great Chinese master of the Tang dynasty, called Linji in Chinese or Rinzai in Japanese, said Zen is like using a yellow leaf to stop a child crying. A child is crying for gold, and the father takes an autumn leaf that's yellow and says, gold. Or he said it's like using an empty fist to deceive a child. See, you've got a closed fist, and you say to the child, what have I got here? And the child says, let me see. Oh, put your fist behind your back. And the child becomes more and more excited to know what the devil's in that fist. And fights and fights and fights, and finally is practically in tears. And then suddenly you finally open the fist and there's nothing inside. So in exactly the same way, the person who is under the impression that there is something that we ought to get. See, all this is dressed up in a big way. To be a Buddha, to know the answer, to finally solve the problem, to get the message, to get the word, or however you put it. In other words, to be in control of your fate and of the world. Would you like it? If you could have it? And so all these powers are projected upon the Zen master. He is a Buddha. He is a master of life. And if he is, the reason why he is that he has discovered the unreality of the whole problem.
Now, this seminar this weekend concerns a subject which is so alien from anything that we understand in the West that it may stretch your skulls a little. I don't know. But as Westerners face certain forms of Mahayana Buddhism from the outside, they see what reminds them of total irrationality and superstition. And this, in particular, applies to a form of Buddhism which has several names. And they're all, well, it's really one form of Buddhism, but it's named differently. And they are all sub-schools of Mahayana. It's variously known as Vajrayana, Tantrayana, or Mantrayana. You remember the word yana means a course, basically, sometimes a vehicle. And Buddhism is fundamentally likened to a vehicle or something like a raft which you use for crossing a river. Or let's say you want to get in at a door and you have to knock and you need a brick to knock on the door with, so you pick up the brick and bang on the door. That's a yana. It's an instrument, an expedient, a means, a technique, a method. And the Buddha's doctrine is called in Sanskrit the dharma, and dharma has a whole multiplicity of meanings, but one of them is method. Although it's usually translated law in English, this is not a good translation. So the yana, the whole idea of a yana is related to the idea of upaya, which I have previously explained to you. U-P-A-Y-A, meaning skillful means, what we would call a pedagogical device or sort of trick, because upaya in politics means cunning. But in religion or philosophy, it means the skill of a teacher in getting something across to a student. And so the whole essence of upaya is really surprise. Because everybody wants a surprise, but you can't surprise yourself, because you know in advance what you're going to do. When you have hiccups, then indeed you surprise yourself because you didn't intend to. And upaya and surprise is deeply connected with the whole inner meaning of Buddhism. Life has to surprise itself. Because if it doesn't, you don't know you're there. Because you only know existence to the degree that there is a balance between knowing and not knowing. See? So there must be the surprise. There must always be something in you, in other words, that is sort of spiritual hiccups that happens unbeknownst. So an upaya is a method of the teacher producing the surprise of enlightenment in the student, and he uses a jnana, that is to say a vehicle or a course, just like we say we give a course in philosophy or semantics or chemistry or something. And so the course then is the Mahayana, the great course, which includes ever so many different upayas or different ways. The Hinayana, the little course, which has only a few ways. Now, in the Hinayana, they are very tough-minded, and they stick to the notion that all enlightenment depends on your own effort. The Buddha is supposed to have said just before he died, "Be you lamps unto yourselves, be you a refuge unto yourselves. Take to yourselves no other refuge." And in Japanese classification of Buddhist schools, they have two that are respectively called Jiriki and Tariki, and they classify all schools of Buddhism under these headings. Ji means self, Riki means power. So there are ways of salvation, or better, more accurately, liberation, by your own power, Jiriki, and then Tariki are the ways by the power of another. That is to say, liberation through what Christians would call grace, rather than works. And it's fascinating how the problem of faith and works, or grace and works, turns up in Buddhism just as it does in Christianity. And it's really the same problem. You see, in the history of Christianity, there was a huge argument around 400 AD between a Welshman, or a Celt, by the name of Pelagius, and Augustine of Hippo. And Pelagius was a kind of optimistic Britisher who believed in muddling through and playing the game and putting your nose to the grindstone and so on. And he believed that one's own will and effort could obey the commandments of God, because he argued that God would not have given us any commandments unless we could have obeyed them. But St. Augustine said that he missed the point entirely, that if he had read St. Paul properly, especially the Epistle to the Romans, he would have found out that God did not give us commandments in order that we should obey them, but in order to prove that we couldn't. That is to say, as St. Paul put it, to convict us of sin. That the law, in other words, was a gimmick, an upaya. Nobody was ever expected to obey the law. The Ten Commandments, summarizing the law. Especially, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. Nobody can do that at all. And so even the greatest saints are always beating their breasts and confessing that they're abysmal sinners, because they've realized that they can't live up to the commandments. So therefore, St. Paul taught that the law, he said, is a pedagogue to lead us to Christ. And you see, a pedagogue has the same meaning as upaya. So what the law does is make you feel absolutely awful because you can't obey it or do anything about it. Now the Buddhists have come to an exactly similar conclusion in the course of time, because the Buddha was apparently in his original teaching tough-minded and said, listen, boys, you better discipline yourselves, see? And you get to work and you cut out women and drink and possessions and meditate and control your minds. Whew. Well, everybody tried this. And of course they couldn't do it. A few people did. Only they dried up. They found that it was a kind of a Pyrrhic victory. That what you gain by stopping your humanity and stopping your emotion isn't worth getting. It's like cutting off your head to cure the headache. So they realized that wasn't the way. But that was why Buddha suggested it, so that they'd find out. So then came in the new schools of Buddhism, which said that you must be liberated by tariki. And ta, as I said, means other power. That is to say, the power of something in you that is not your ego, just in the same way as your heart doesn't beat at the will of your ego. So in psychoanalysis, for example, we would say that the unconscious has to be worked on, and that it will be watered and nourished and so on, and eventually the unconscious will produce your integration. This is Jungian language, not Freudian. And you depend on that. It's not you. Because, of course, integration means that you get the two aspects of yourself together and acknowledge them both as you, the conscious and the unconscious, the power of the ego and the power of the natural organism, of the psyche. And so in every art one realizes there comes a point where your will is exhausted. You've tried everything to make something work, and it won't work. And then to achieve the perfection of the art, something has to happen of itself, which we variously call grace, inspiration, or tariki. And the problem that everybody has always wanted to know is how to make that happen. Now, you see, if we knew how to make it happen, it wouldn't be it. Because it would be something we were doing. And it would be, therefore, the old story of just simply an ego effort. And so we don't know how to make it happen. But if you just settle for that and say, well, sorry, but there's nothing you can do about it, everybody's just going to go home. And forget the whole thing and commit suicide. The thing is, therefore, the state we call faith is the key. And faith means that we know it will happen. Only we've got to wait. Only don't wait too hard, because that will be ego effort again and will stop it happening. So the thing is to learn to wait soft. That is to say, in a state of openness. Well, now, how do you do that? There are all sorts of upayas, you see, means that help one to do this. And one of them is this thing that I've been referring to as the Vajra Yana. That means the diamond vehicle. The Tantra Yana, that means the web vehicle. And the Mantra Yana, which means the sound vehicle. Sound in the sense of incantation. I may as well begin with Mantra Yana aspect of it, because this is the most perplexing to us from our point of view. and doesn't make any sense. But you know there is an age-old belief in spells, and that certain formulae said in the right way will produce results. All of this descends philosophically, so far as Asia is concerned, from the Hindu Upanishadic idea that the world is the creation of sound. The Hindus say that in the beginning was Vak, which is exactly the same thing as saying in the beginning was the Word, as in the Gospel of St. John. But that doesn't mean the orders, like give him the word. The Vak means vibration. And so the name that is fundamentally Vak is the Sanskrit word Om. Because when you say Om, you begin at the back of your throat with O and you finish at your lips. And so you take in the whole range of sound. And so this word Om is called the Pranava. And it is the holiest of all names. And so you can chant Om, you know, and really stir up things. And so all but Hindus and Buddhists alike use this word Om. And will use it to set going a meditative state. This is very easy to do because it's awfully easy to concentrate on sound. It's much more difficult to keep your eyes still. You flicker because your eyes tend constantly to, it's natural for the eyes to rove over things. And you get, have difficulty in stopping your eyes from scanning. But sound is very easy to concentrate on. And the whole point of a mantra is it's a method of digging sound. Now, I hope you know what I mean by that, because I purposely used a very slangy, popular word, to dig. That means get right down into. So that you realize that the flow, the vibration of sound is a way in which you experience basic existence, being here. And you can learn everything from it, because sound is not a constant. It comes and it goes. It's on and off. You only hear it because it is vibrating. And so herein is the lesson that life is on and off, black and white, life and death, inside and outside, knowing and not knowing. They're all in the vibration. But it's easy to explain that in words. But to understand it in your bones, to feel it, you have to learn how to listen to a sound. So then they invented this way of making chanting sounds. Now there are various ways in which this is understood by people in Asia. Incidentally, I should say that this, as a form of Buddhism, what I'm calling Vajrayana, the whole movement, sprung up in about the 9th century A.D. And its geographical distribution is from North India into Tibet, China and Japan and Mongolia. And it is highly characteristic of Tibetan Buddhism. So then, let's say there are various ways of understanding it. The formulas used for mantra are understood by the ignorant as being shortcuts. Instead of saying the whole sutra is summed up in the formula Om Mani Padme Hum. And you can say that. That'll do. You're a poor, weak slob, and out of infinite compassion, the bodhisattvas have arranged to get you to nirvana. Instead of going through all the heroic efforts of those saints and sages and meditation practices, you can just say Om Mani Padme Hum. And in fact, you don't even need to say it. You can have it printed on paper and enclosed in a silver box on the end of a stick. And all you have to do is rotate the thing. So the popular idea of this is the shortcut. The next idea of it is the one I've been sort of talking about, which is that you concentrate on these formulae, on these sounds. And there's a third interpretation, which is you might call the esoteric interpretation, which was originally, as far as I know, the first person to really bring this up was Vasubandhu, whom I told you about last week, who lived, shortly before 400. And he said the whole point of mantra is that they don't mean anything at all. And that the word Om is completely meaningless. And that all these various different kinds of incantations are totally senseless. And the idea of repeating them is to liberate yourself from the notion that the universe means anything. All those forms of Buddhism which are associated with the Vajrayana are what is called tantric. And tantric, the word basically means web structure, warp and woof. Well now, Tantra in Hindu context is a discipline that is sometimes called the fifth Veda. There are 4 Vedas, which are basic holy scriptures of Hinduism. The 5th Veda is, as it were, the esoteric one. Now, according to the 4 Vedas, in order to be liberated, you have to give up physical life. That is to say, you must not eat meat, you must not have sexual intercourse, you must not take alcohol or any kind of consciousness-changing substance. There are various other things, I forget them all. But in Tantra, the whole idea is liberation through the forbidden things. That is to say, liberation in the world, belonging to the world, participating in the world. And sometimes it is therefore called the left-hand path. Once, there's a Hindu story, you know, that the Brahma was asked the question, who will gain to union with you first, he who loves you or he who hates you? And Brahma replied, he who hates me, because he will think of me more often. So, you can, in other words, attain to liberation by one of 2 ways. One is by complete altruism, and the other is by total selfishness. And the moral of the whole thing is that if you are completely and consistently selfish, you will discover that yourself is the other. That you don't really experience yourself at all except in terms of others. When you say, I love myself, what do you mean? You mean you love being alive. And when you push it, you see, this is the point, to push it to an extreme. So the left-hand path is a very dangerous way of going about things, because nobody approves of it. I was discussing this morning with my father that sometime in the distant past we had witnessed a comedy wherein the stage was set of a man asleep in bed in a highly Victorian bedroom with all kinds of fancy furniture and terrible stuff, you know. And the alarm clock goes off. And he wakes up in a total rage. He immediately picks up his shoe and smashes the alarm clock. He then gets out of bed in fury. He rips the sheets to pieces, overturns the bed, finds a hammer somewhere, and starts breaking up all the crockery, the windows, and until the place is a total demolition. Finally, there is left in one corner one of those enormous standard lamps. You know, with all the sort of gewgaws on it. And he takes several runs at this, and finally he picks it up and he flings it in the air. And as it comes down, it bounces. It is made of rubber. And this is the flip, you see. And that's the surprise I was talking about in the beginning. Satori, sudden awakening. It bounced. You know, you thought you were going to crash and you bounced. And you see, this is the whole thing about Buddhism. We all think we're going to crash. And it must seem that way, because otherwise it won't be a surprise to bounce. So, if, in other words, you press your selfishness and you go into this whole question of what do I really want? Supposing I could have it. Supposing I had all the money, anything I can think of. What is it I'm after? And you explore all the sensations you can imagine, all the delights of pleasure, all the ecstasies, all the drunks, all the orgasms, all the anything you can think of. Go right through to the end of it. What is it you're looking for? You say, oh, I want to be flipped. You know, I want to be let out of myself. Well, when you're let out of yourself, that's altruism. He that would save his life shall lose it. And he that loses his life, or looseth his life, shall find it. You go one way or the other, and it all comes to the same thing. All right, so in the same way, take the path of meditative discipline on concentration, where somebody is sitting there with a stick and says, you attend. See, I'm the master. You follow that way. See what you want to get that out of that. Try and get rid of yourself. That's one way of doing it. And there's certain kind of people who ought to take it that way. They want to. They don't know they're here unless they hurt. And that's the right way for them. We shouldn't condemn it. It's just like there are certain kinds of plants that grow this way, there are certain kinds of plants that go this way, and so there are many types. On the other hand, there's the mantra game, where people say, oh, this is so simple to do. You really don't have to chant it at all. It's just the shortest formula, and it's just this kind of cut. And then they get going into this thing, and they get fascinated. Singing, Om Mani Padme Hum, so something like that. Or like those Pure Land Buddhists in Japan. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And it eventually comes, you know, and you really get with it. And when you get with it, you suddenly realize it's doing you. Now, what's the difference between you and it? Self and other. Self-power, other power. Jiriki, tariki. It's all one. Only you play it isn't. Because you have to do that. I say have to. That's not quite the right word. You do that in order to create the sensation of existence. It's called Now You See It.